Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. I'm very excited tonight because without further ado, we're just going to jump right into the book. Let's get started with chapter 24. Enjoy. Chapter 24. Under the Sea. How many of you started singing the song? I did. It's still going. The next day, we had already forgotten all our past sufferings. At first, I was surprised at not feeling thirsty anymore, and for a moment I wondered why this was. The murmuring stream running at my feet gave me the answer. We had breakfast and drank some of this excellent ferruginous water. I felt wonderfully cheered and resolved to go a long way. Why shouldn't a man as determined as my uncle attain his object when he was accompanied by a guide as industrious as Hans and a nephew as devoted as myself? Such were the splendid ideas which occurred to me. If anyone had suggested that I should return to the summit of Sneffels, I would have refused with the utmost indignation. Fortunately, all we had to do was descend. "Let us start!" I cried, awakening with my shout the oldest echoes in the world. We set off again at 8 on Thursday morning. The winding granite tunnel had all sorts of unexpected bends and seemed as tortuous as a maze, but its general direction was consistently southeast. My uncle kept consulting his compass very attentively to keep account of the way we had come. The gallery was almost horizontal, with a slope of 1 in 40 at the most. The murmuring stream ran gently at our feet. I thought of it as a sort of familiar spirit guiding us underground, and now and then I stroked the warm naiad whose singing accompanied our steps. Good humor has always taken a mythological form with me. As for my uncle, he kept inveighing against the horizontal nature of the path as an enthusiast for verticals. Our route seemed to be stretching away into infinity, and instead of sliding down the terrestrial radius, as he put it, we were traveling along the hypotenuse. But we had no choice. As long as we were approaching the center, however gradually, we could not grumble. Besides, every now and then the slope became steeper, our naiad tumbled down it with a moan, and we went deeper with her. On the whole, however, that day and the next we made considerable progress horizontally, but comparatively little vertically. In the evening of Friday, the 10th of July, according to our calculations, we were 75 miles southwest of Reykjavik and 7 miles down. Then, all of a sudden, a frightening shaft opened at our feet. My uncle could not help clapping his hands for joy when he saw how steep it was. "Now we shall make progress," he cried, "and without much effort, because the projections of the rock make a regular staircase." The ropes were fastened by Hans so as to guard against all possibility of accident, and the descent continued. I can scarcely describe it as perilous, for I was already familiar with this sort of operation. This shaft was a narrow crack in the granite mass, of the kind geologists would call a fault, and it had obviously been caused by the contraction of the earth's crust while it was cooling. If it had once been a passage for the eruptive matter thrown up by Sneffels, I could not understand why that matter had left no trace. We were descending a sort of spiral staircase which looked as if it had been made by the hand of man. Every quarter of an hour we had to pause to take a rest and relieve our leg muscles. We would sit down on some projecting rock with our legs dangling, chatting while we ate and drinking from the stream. Needless to say, in this fault, the Hansbach had become a cascade and lost some of its volume as a result. But it still provided more than enough water to satisfy our thirst. Besides, when the slope became gentler, it would be sure to resume its peaceful course. At the moment, it reminded me of my worthy uncle, with his fists of impatience and anger, while on gentler slopes it was more like our calm Icelandic guide. On the 11th and 12th of July, we followed the spirals of this fault, penetrating another 5 miles deeper into the earth's crust, or about 13 miles below sea level. But on the 13th, about midday, the fault took a much gentler slope, of about 45 degrees in a southeasterly direction. The path then became easy and absolutely monotonous. This was inevitable, for the journey could scarcely be enlivened by changes in the landscape. On Wednesday, the 15th, we were 18 miles underground and about 125 miles from Sneffels. Although we were a little tired, our health was perfectly satisfactory and the medicine chest was still untouched. My uncle took hourly readings of the compass and the chronometer and the manometer and the thermometer, those which he had published in the scientific report on his journey. It was therefore a simple matter for him to establish his whereabouts. When he told me that we had traveled 125 miles horizontally, I could not help giving an exclamation of surprise. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing. I was just thinking." "Thinking of what, my boy?" "That if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "We can easily make sure. I took some measurements with my compass on the map." "I was right," I said. "We've passed Cape Portland, and those 125 miles to the southeast have brought us under the sea." "Under the sea," repeated my uncle, rubbing his hands with delight. "So the ocean is over our heads," I exclaimed. "Why, of course, Axel. What could be more natural? Aren't there coal mines at Newcastle that extend a long way under the sea?" The professor might consider this situation to be perfectly natural, but I felt a little uneasy at the thought of that mass of water over my head. Yet it really made very little difference whether it was the plains and the mountains of Iceland that we had over us or the waves of the Atlantic, provided that the granite underpinning held good. In any case, I rapidly became accustomed to the idea, for the gallery, now running straight, now winding about, as capricious in its slopes as in its detours, but constantly heading southeast and always going deeper, soon took us to very great depths indeed. 4 days later, on Saturday, the 18th of July, we arrived in the evening in a sort of huge grotto. My uncle gave Hans his weekly wages of 3 riksdaler, and it was decided the next day should be a day of rest. And that's the end of chapter 24. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories. But until then, be well and sleep well.